Welcome to Redeeming Missions, a podcast from Every Home for Christ about the complexity of Christian missions and evangelism in our time. We host conversations that will challenge us through unique global perspectives and honest stories. Redeeming Missions is a podcast for ministry leaders, passionate evangelists, and the rest of us who might be a little bit more cautious or even disenchanted with the topic. Together, we're on a journey to find the heart of what it means to carry Christ to our world. I'm your host, Tanner Peak, and I'm so glad you're joining me today. Well, welcome to this episode of Redeeming Missions Podcast. So happy that you join us. I'm really excited today with the guest that we have, a man who's been dear to my heart. His name is Glenn Packiam. He was, until most recently, I would have considered him my pastor here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'm gonna go ahead and read just a little bit about Glenn. Glenn is the lead pastor today of Rock Harbor Church in Costa Mesa, California. Glenn is the author of several books, including Resilient Pastor, which I can't recommend more highly, Blessed, Broken, Given, and the newest book co-authored by his wife Holly, The Intentional Year. He's earned a doctorate in theology and ministry from Durham University and is a senior fellow at the Barna Group, a visiting fellow at St. John's College at Durham University, and an ordained priest with the Anglican Church in North America. Glenn's also a worship leader. He's written over 65 worship songs published by Integrity Music, and he has 4 kids living and a wife living in Orange County, California. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Tanner, it's just so good to talk to you, man, and good to see you and, catch up here.
Yeah, I got to be honest a little bit, Glenn. I'm still a little stinging from you leaving Colorado Springs, moving to California. We haven't had a sit down to talk that through, but you've definitely left a hole in the Peak family for me specifically.
That's very sweet. Listen, we never saw ourselves leaving. I mean, we were there for 22 years.
Yeah, a long time.
And loved it. But when you feel the Lord tugging to say, hey, would you put everything on the table, or to use the biblical metaphor, put it all on the altar before me, sometimes the Lord really does take you up on those words when you say, Lord, you can use me in any way. I surrender, So here we are. We've been at Rock Harbor for a year, and it's been wonderful. What a gift. I know, a year.
It's been a year?
It's been a year.
Oh, man. Yeah. I think since COVID, my sense of time is pretty messed up. So I appreciate you, Glenn, taking the time, jumping on this podcast with me. The way that we've been starting these podcasts is we just have people share their story. And a lot of times that's all we end up talking about is because I love people's story. So I'm wondering if just as we jump in here, if you could just share with me and share with the audience just a little bit of your story, how you've become the kind of person that you are today.
Yeah, that could be taken a few ways, how I've become the person
No, I meant it in the best way possible.
No, I know. I know. I'm just making a light here, it's like a therapy session. No, listen, I look back at the journey so far, and I'm so grateful for the faithfulness of God, the kindness of God, the kindness of people. All of us, Tanner, we look back and there's people that contributed in significant ways. So I'll just map out some of the major mile markers of my story. I'm originally from Malaysia.
Yeah.
And sometimes people hear me say that and they're like, oh, like you grew up there with your parents missionaries. Like, no, I'm from Malaysia. My mom was born in Singapore. My dad was born in Malaysia. They met at the University of Singapore. Wow. My mom was kind of a nominal Christian at the time. My dad was a Hindu. And as they started to date, the joke is that she said, I'm not marrying a Hindu, and he converted right away. I say that sometimes to get some laughs. But the truth is, it was more complicated than that. The Lord had been working in his heart, and he had been feeling the kind of hollowness of the empty rituals and superstitions in Hinduism, and was really drawn by the idea or the presentation of a personal God, a loving father. My dad would specifically say the idea of a loving father really gripped him, So he converted, but it took him a few years before faith really became, kind of real to them. So by the time my sister and I came along, I have one older sister, my parents had really experienced kind of this born again moment that they would describe, where faith became personal and real and full. And then they were discipled by they were attending an Anglican church on the weekends, and they were attending this midweek Bible study led by a Baptist pastor, and so they were kind of getting it from all sides. And then they started experiencing the charismatic renewal, which is amazing because it's why, Tanner, I think to this day it's built into my bones almost, like this appreciation for the wide, diverse body of Christ. The many streams that have maybe different emphases, but that are the richness of the church. When I was 10, we moved from Malaysia to America. My parents went to a Bible college there, and it was a massive thing. I think about them because they were around my wife and I's stage of life now. That's how old my parents were when we made the move. And it's interesting, Tanner, because this is a podcast all about missions and how we reframe what we think about who a missionary is. And of course, every Home for Christ, we're determined to help every Christian think in a missional way, but I grew up reading like these stories of missionaries. I grew up reading stories of Hudson Taylor, David Livingstone, and, these amazing stories. So we moved to America, and I wasn't thinking, I'm coming to another country as a missionary. And I certainly think my parents thought of it as they were getting training to be sent back to Malaysia. And that's what happened. We moved back to Malaysia 3 years later. I was 13, finished out my high school years. But I think in some ways the Lord, was sending me and preparing me, even reading those stories of missionaries, sending me out of my comfort zone and to think about the rest of my life as being devoted to Him. So that began the process of my high school years of kind of discerning, Lord, what is this kind of vocational call on my life? And I thought maybe music, maybe this or that. So I studied theological historical studies, but was very involved with the chapel praise and worship team at Oral Roberts University, where I did my undergrad. And from there, it led to connections that were at New Life at church in Colorado Springs. And so my first 8 or 9 years on staff at New Life were primarily leading worship, writing music, of course, pastoring people one-on-one and teaching some here and there in the college ministry and sometimes on the weekends. But 2009, right as I hit into my 30s, I started to discern, like, Lord, where are you really nudging me? And that's when I really fell in love with the local church in a fresh way. We experienced a pretty turbulent season at New Life. 2006 was a scandal that rocked our church, the founding senior pastor. 2007 was a shooting that occurred on the campus of our church. I'm obviously breezing through some major, major moments. But I think, and those had significance in so many ways, and they were tragic in very obvious ways. And for me, the Lord worked through those seasons to clarify this call to serve as a pastor in the local church. And so we started a Sunday night service at New Life, eventually started our first off-site congregation called New Life Downtown, as you know.
Yeah.
And had the privilege of serving that congregation for 10 years. And then from there came this call to come and serve Rock Harbor as lead pastor just over a year ago. So that's the high points. And the music and worship stuff, I think of it this way, Tanner, like my life has always been about, or is meant to be about, maybe meant to when I'm faithful to it, helping to raise up worshipers in spirit and in truth, that John 4 desire of the Father. And I think sometimes I've done that from the musical side with a guitar in my hands. Sometimes I've done it with a Bible in my hands. Sometimes I've done it across coffee tables in classrooms, wherever. I think the goal for me is always to help people see greater truth and greater depth of the Spirit. And in all of it, not to just gain knowledge or notches on our spiritual belt, but to be able to say, we actually the end game is that we all become worshipers.
It's so interesting that you say that your life calling is to see worshipers in spirit and in truth. I'm coming from a missions. I'm sitting here within an organization that's committed to evangelism around the world, and that could be the exact same response from many of our evangelists around the world. Is that their heart as evangelists are that, and I just see you. I've seen that. I've seen you embody that in different seasons. I was actually part of Sunday night as well. I remember going up and enjoying our time, just fellowshipping there, and just the unique expression that you've always led people in, Glenn. You've always really done a good job, I think, of carrying people's hearts before the Lord and really pastoring them, nurturing us, I'd say us, into maturity. And so I'm really grateful for your story. There's 100 different places that I could jump in and ask more questions. One of the things as you're talking, I'm still a little bit curious about what that was like for you to move from Malaysia. And you mentioned, you had these missional heroes in the back of your mind, whether it's Hudson Taylor or whoever else, Henry Martin. And when you moved to the U.S., did you see that as, you were sent to the U.S., or was it not like that? It was more like preparation to come back. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, that's great, Tanner. I think our family understood it as preparation for a mission that was coming back. And my parents, especially because it was a mid-career switch. They went from this. My dad was working in an ad agency. My mom was teaching at a school, and they both came back and started serving at the church, helping to launch a Bible school of their own. And then a few years after that, planted a church out in kind of a rural community. So it definitely was seen as a season of preparation. And for me, I was 10 years old, so it was partly. I mean, although it's funny, there's a book my parents gave me that I read partly on the flight over. It was the autobiography of George Mueller.
Yes.
People who know George Mueller, he started all these orphanages, I think, in Bristol in England.
Yeah.
And my parents gave it to me as sort of this, you're not too young to start to discern God's heart for the world. And I was so marked by that. It's funny, Tanner. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to write books. When I was like 10 or 11 or 12, I had this little exercise, workbook, like a school, like a lined rule book, whatever those, it wasn't spiral bound, but it was like one of those things, workbook. And I had started to write my own little book, and it was all about how to be an evangelist, So I definitely kind of internalized the family call of this is preparation so that we can go, share the good news with people.
That is so wild. I think sometimes that the word evangelism has kind of been accosted, or it's been hijacked, and it's taken now, I think, in such a negative way by so many in the U.S., I think, or in the Western environment. I believe it might have been a Barna statistic that I had read not that long ago, that the word evangelism to 85% of the United States populace is seen as a form of religious extremism. And so I kind of have a passion to see that word in some ways brought back into the psyche of people, but not in such, maybe what the populace is picking up or the average non-Christian is picking up in evangelism. Maybe there is something that we need to walk away from. Something that we could, but something that we could carry forward with us with that word evangelism. So when you hear that word, when I say evangelism, you're one of the smartest people I know. How would you define evangelism here today in the 21st century?
Tanner, I'm not one of the smartest people, but
you
but
are
I think,
for sure.
No, listen, but I think I understand why there's a negative association with it, because I think in people's experience, evangelism has felt coercive.
Yeah.
It has felt pushy. It has felt salesy.
Yeah.
And I think even for a lot of Christians in the West, in particular, the idea of evangelism was a technique, a sales technique, essentially. Like, you do this, ask them this question, then go,
Yeah, a lot of bait and switch.
Yes, and it kind of grew up at the same time in American culture that door-to-door salesmen were growing up, so you kind of had these associations with, is he selling me a vacuum cleaner or eternal salvation?
Right.
And it's unfortunate, because I think the ministry of evangelism, or let's define it. Okay, so evangelism, a lot of people will know this. Evangelion is the Greek word there. It means good news. The evangel is the person who carries good news. And in some ways, it has its roots in maybe echoes of Isaiah saying, "Blessed are the feet of those in the mountains who carry good news." So it's a good news of Yahweh's arrival or Yahweh's return. And so there's an Old Testament echo in that of God has come at last. And man, couldn't there, like when I think about the world around us, Tanner, and you think about the brokenness in society, and not just in America, but especially, maybe it's easier for us to see brokenness in other places, but at the same time, we got to be careful we don't ignore the brokenness in our own hearts and communities. But there's evidence all around, is my point. And when you see that, you think, gosh, who can fix this? Surely it's not another election or another program or just as simple as this and that or the other. The only answer is if God comes to us again. And so the good news, the first echo, is that God has come at last to do what he promised. That's great news. And then the Roman echo in the first century would have been that Caesar's king. I mean, that word, euangelion, gets used to announce Caesar's birth, to announce his reign. Augustus, Julius Caesar's, adopted son, who kind of, very much plays up that heritage, because when Caesar is crowned or sort of hailed as a god, Augustus says, "Oh, that makes me son of God," and he plays this game of pretending to be humble, laying down his powers before the Senate, only to have them crown him with supreme power. I mean, it's a lot like how Senator Palpatine becomes the supreme chancellor in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Anyway, but there are these echoes, and there are monuments that we can look at from the ancient world that say, "Good news, Augustus is Lord," and definitely the early Christians were playing off of this and saying, Jesus is Lord, and his lordship is good news because he brings actual freedom. He's actually the Prince of Peace. The Pax Romana is a sham, and even Roman writers would later say Caesar calls it peace, but really he's pillaged and plundered and oppressed people, and it's propaganda to call it peace. And so the early Christians were like, we've got a king and a Lord who actually brings freedom, who actually brings peace. I say all that to say, reclaiming evangelism is reclaiming good news. It's reclaiming the good news of what we have to say to the world. And what we have to say to the world is, there is a new king. There is God himself who has not abandoned us. There is freedom. There is peace. There's forgiveness of sins. And so evangelism is the proclamation or announcement of the good news that God has come at last in Jesus Christ to be King of the world in such a way that sets the captives free and brings peace to our hearts.
I think that your theological analysis is just so rich, but also your social analysis that you kind of started out with there, talking about how evangelism grew up at the same time that door-to-door sales emerged. And I think that's actually really keen insight. I think I'm speaking certainly as a millennial. I'm speaking as a millennial leading a global evangelism organization. And I think even myself, I think that if someone were to come and to knock on my door today, or and start to ask me questions about my faith, immediately there would just be suspicion. Just immediately I would say,
Yes.
what are you doing at my door?
Yeah.
Why? What on earth? I don't know you. I've never seen your face. For all I know, you could be selling anywhere from, magazines to pans. It could be anything. And I think with scarcity of time, I'm not looking to have that conversation in that way. And especially when there's that degree of suspicion. And I think so many people in the West, they probably relate to that to some degree. Glenn, I have some of our best friends are non-Christians, and that in the last years, my wife and my whole family, and I talk with them openly about my faith all of the time, but do so within the context of this rich relationship. And never once have I ever been told, to close my mouth or to not believe what I believe. It's never been that way. In fact, they're always very open and very receptive. But I asked them one time, "What do you think about evangelism?" And they were just like, "Ugh. Yeah. What on earth is wrong with Christians that they think that they can just show up and speak to these things in our life without any relationship or without any context." So with this, I was intending to talk about something completely different, but now you got me. Now you got me stirred up. What do you think it is in the 21st century? To bring good news.
Tanner, it's complex because I think it's contextual.
Yeah.
And you lead a global organization, as you said, and I know every time I've gotten together with you or with Eric or some different ones from your team, and hear stories from your larger team all around the world, I'm blown away because God is creative and God knows how to help us contextualize. I think, even biblically, one of the great lessons we learn from the book of Acts is the growth of the church or the spread of the gospel is not programmatic.
Yeah.
Meaning that it is intentional, and there are certain things we learn from the book of Acts. But what we really learn from the book of Acts is the Holy Spirit is so creative and so powerful that he'll work differently in Antioch than he might in Jerusalem, and different in Ephesus than he might, and all of that we have to take that into account. Let me speak for my context here in yours as well in America. And maybe even here in California, out on the West Coast, I think what it's really confirmed some of the suspicions I've had even over the years in Colorado, and that is that I don't think we start with the personal. Meaning, I don't think we start with personal guilt. I think there was a day where evangelism
You're right.
started by saying, "Don't you wish you could find forgiveness for all the things you've done wrong?" And there was a strategy. It's like, let's start by talking about, have you failed this moral code, or let's start by the Ten Commandments. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I just don't know that that's the first window into a
Yeah.
connection with somebody else's heart. I think we actually start with the cosmic, and
Yeah.
and this is where it's so important for Christians to have a wide angle lens understanding of salvation. Salvation in all of its wholeness. That Greek word for salvation, sozo, is about being made whole. It's about God putting the world back together again. It's about the restoration and renewal of all things, including, yes, including at the very heart of it, putting us and our relationship with God back together. I 100% agree with that. I'm simply talking about where we start. Do we start with the individual and work our way out to the cosmic? No, I suspect in our day in America today, we've got to start with the global, or maybe another way to say it is the social. And to say, it's kind of like the words of that wonderful Andrew Peterson song, do you feel the world is broken?
Yeah.
We do, we do. And do we long for everything to be made new?
Yeah, we
you know.
do.
And you start with that, and then you say, you know who is doing this? It's Jesus. And then you say, now what about us? Like we don't want to be the people that say, oh my gosh, that person, that party, that country, that movement. What about us? And as you kind of focus the lens in click by click into the individual, all of a sudden then you say, well, actually my own heart is messed up. I can't even control my own reactivity. And then we say, yes, so we need forgiveness, don't we? And we need more than that. We need power to become different. We need more than a new start. We need a new birth. We need a new life. And that's I think a possible model for evangelism in the West today.
I think so too. I love what you said about context. That is what I love about Every Home for Christ. And I'm not just saying that because I lead this organization. It's rubbed off on me. I think I've seen around the world, I've seen people look at people in the eyes and carry Christ to them in thousands of contextual ways, and meaningful ways. And I think that I'm really wrecked. That's changed my life, seeing the way that Christ is carried across cultures in so many different ways. So like you said, not programmatic, just in the way that's born from the Holy Spirit. But I wonder, what you're saying about kind of the individualistic aspect. We live in a hyper individualistic society that seems like, I would say my layman's, my coffee mug kind of assessment of sociology. It seems like we're an individualistic society getting even more individualistic. And do you feel like there's any correlation with maybe the West running towards even more hyper individualism and the way that we've evangelized, and maybe the way that that's impacted, I guess, the way that people are viewing evangelism?
100%. And actually, your coffee mug assessment is spot on with a well-respected secular sociologist
Nice.
named Jean Twenge, I think is how you say her last name. She's a sociologist at the University of San Diego. Years ago, she wrote the book iGen, got a lot of buzz for that. But her latest book is called Generations, and
That's right.
kind of her magnum opus. And she gets to the part of the chapter on millennials, and then Gen Z, and her assessment on why religion is declining so quickly among millennials and then Gen Z is because of an increasing rise of individualism. And not just individualism in terms of sometimes we think of individualism as selfish. I think she's describing an individualism that has come to believe that you can curate your entire life around your own preferences and desires.
Yeah.
And I think about that, Tanner, as a pastor. I think I'm constantly trying to shepherd people to say, if you have a Spotify playlist from here and a podcast from here and a YouTube from here, and a hangout group here, that's not the same thing as being committed to a local church.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, take the non-believing world. What is religion? What is organized religion? Why do I need to ascribe to a set of beliefs? Why do I have to take the whole sort of confession of Christian faith? I like what Jesus said about this, and I like what Buddha said about this, and I like my meditation practice here, but that Sabbath thing sounds pretty cool, and on it goes. And so our challenge with evangelism is we are bringing a message that makes a claim on our total life.
Yeah.
This is what Leslie Newbegin said decades ago, coming back from a pluralistic society in India and coming back to England and saying, whoa, 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 the gospel in a pluralistic society means that we have to announce the gospel, not as a private truth, but as a public truth that makes total claims on our life. And man, there's no way around the confrontational nature of the good news. I've talked about it as good news, but we also have to be honest. There's a cross that comes with this good news. And I think it is challenging in the West precisely because of this individualism. We don't want to dethrone self.
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe to add what you're saying, or maybe a follow-up question would be around, do you feel like individualism is having its way? And I mean, maybe we're seeing a fracturing in our world that is coming about because of this hyper individualism. Just this morning, I was reading some statistics from the World Health Organization. Over 300 million people on the planet having an anxiety disorder, depression. Over 250 million people on the planet having struggling with chronic depression. And I really believe these are real things. These are real experiences that people are living through. And in the missions world, we've talked about people groups. The Uyghurs living in Western China, or various groups living across Africa. But I was looking at it in a new light of thinking, what does it mean to carry Christ to this community that's today struggling with depression, or today that's struggling with anxiety? You're a pastor of a local church, and I imagine that you see maybe the outcomes of our hyper-individualism. Is my assessment correct that maybe individualism, taken to its extreme, is actually causing some of these maladies that we're seeing today, or what would be your assessment of that?
No, I think so, Tanner, absolutely. And I don't say that simply from my anecdotal experience, although that's there. Great philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a huge book called The Secular Age. I did not read all of it.
That's a meaty book. Yeah.
I just want to be honest with our listeners here today. I did read
I appreciate
James K. Smith's summary of it, How Not to Be Secular. But Taylor talks about this as an age of anxiety, and he's not using that word clinically, so I want to be careful here with that caveat. But I think there is a kind of angst that results from putting too much weight or strain on an individual that an individual was not meant to carry. And so often the pastoral conversations I'm having with people is what our culture has told us, or the lie that we've been sold, is if you could be the author of your own story, if you could be the definer of your own identity, if you could be the captain of your own destiny, then that is freedom, that is liberation. And that's the lie that we've been sold. And so we've said, okay, yes, I'll be the author of my own story. I'll be the determiner of my own identity. I'll be, I will set and then we start to crumble under the weight of that, because we think, I don't know how to write my story. And what happens when I write myself into a corner? What happens when I've failed? What happens when I make a mistake?
Yeah, right.
I don't know how to define my identity. That sounds like, what if I get it wrong? What if I change my mind 2 years from now? The notion and the gender conversation is only one piece of this. The whole of identity has become fluid because we've given the pen to the wrong person. We put it in our hands. And so I do think some of this weight of angst that maybe is manifesting in clinical ways is because we're carrying a sense of power that we weren't meant to carry. We're carrying a weight we weren't meant to bear. And once again, the gospel is good news because it says to us, there's a God who knew you before the foundations of the world. There's a God who knew you in your mother's womb. There's a God who named you and called you and gave his life for you and came for you and saved you and wants to fill you with his spirit and wants to send you out with a purpose and with a mission. There's a God who loves you. That to me is it's revolutionary good news. If it could get to the core of who we are, and if we would be willing to dethrone the self, and turn over the pen to the author and the finisher of our faith.
I think it's so beautiful, and I guess I want to give also a caveat that I'm not saying that I think that depression or anxiety is fully caused because of just
I know that
sociological things. I think I could get myself in hot water there, but I
know you're not saying that.
Yeah. I do feel like it speaks also, though, to the way that we evangelize in the 21st century, especially in the West. Imagine, our society that is filled with people that are, maybe because of the weight of carrying the pen in their story, are struggling with anxiety or depression or, like you said, issues in their identity. And then you show up like a salesman, you show up looking slick and, knock on their door, and we wonder why there's this pushback and this resistance. One of the things I've been trying to wrestle with is, what does the message of heaven and hell sound like to someone who's struggling with chronic anxiety? What does that message sound like? I'm not talking about whether it's right or wrong, true or not true. I'm just saying, what does it actually sound like contextually? What would a message like that sound like? And so these are just, we're at this point just processing.
It's such a good question, Tanner, because there's the whole I think the other part of evangelism that is baked into the name of your organization is hospitality.
Yeah.
The early Christians, when they were the minority group in a pluralistic society, they relied so much on a radical kind of hospitality. I don't mean lemonade or milk and cookies or have people over to your home. I'm talking about the kind of welcoming the outsider or the other. The xenophilia is the Greek word in the New Testament. Is welcoming the stranger, someone who's not like you, someone who's different from you. Christians were at different points and have been at different points in our story really great at this and then really poor at this. But when we've done it well, we've seen the gospel really bear fruit. And when we do it well, we use the power of our homes to create welcoming spaces for people who are not like us, where like what you're doing with these friends of yours, where there's a relational connection and a place to process and a place to unpack. And I think that's so important because, like you said, it's not that we don't believe in the realities of heaven and hell, but sometimes I think we're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Like we're putting in the foreground. Which I look at the preaching in the Book of Acts, and most certainly they talk about a final judgment, but what they really talk about is it's an announcement about Jesus. The gospel is the story of Jesus. There's a reason we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the Gospels, and the bulk of that book is not heaven and hell, if you died tonight. The bulk of that book, those books, are the story of the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. And if we tell that story to a person who's sick or who's depressed or who's chronically anxious, I'm not saying it makes everything go away. I'm not saying it cures all our problems. We know we live in frail bodies with frail brains. That our brain chemistry and all this stuff that we won't see the full redemption of which until the end of the ages, when we get restored bodies. But even that is part of the Jesus story. So when we tell the story of cross and resurrection of the Savior who died and rose again, we're telling the story of a Savior who not only died to take away our sin and our guilt, but a Savior who was raised again so that one day we will be raised up too. One day our brains will not be as fragile and broken as they are now. One day our bodies will not be sick and twisted as they are now. And all of that is part of the Evangelion. All of that is part of the good news we're meant to announce.
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to just process for myself, expanding the aperture of what we bring and what we carry to people, away from just these maybe simple bite-sized evangelistic, bumper sticker type nuggets that we would bring to people, but bringing something broader, bringing a broader message. But I also, you're talking about disruptive hospitality or radical hospitality.
I like that phrase, disruptive hospitality.
Yeah, that brings in people, that brings in maybe the person that is feeling like they're on the outside of society, or they're experiencing particularly the weight of the fall. This type of person being accepted, bringing, belonging to a group, I think is a beautiful picture of a broadened evangelism, a reclaimed evangelism, as you said earlier. In Orange County, you live in a unique spot, a new spot. I know you've been there a year. When I think of Orange County, I think of a place where, a place where success is evident. When you see people and their success, and you can see, just even externally in the cars that they drive and then the houses that they live in. And I know that's naive. I know, there's more to that story. When you look at evangelism, and as we talk about evangelism in the most broad sense, more in an applied sense, what does it look like to carry Christ or to evangelize in a context like Orange County?
Yeah, well, you're not wrong. I mean, it is a place where success is, um, it's kind of it's a reminds me a bit of the biblical city of Corinth. Like
Hmm.
the idea is to appear successful,
Hmm.
and success is defined in a number of different ways. Sometimes success is defined as the perfect body. Sometimes success is defined as the car or the house or the job or the deal, or sometimes success is defined as you don't even have to work, and so you can dress in leisure clothes because you get to just do your hobbies every day. But it's, of course, it's a veneer, and it puts an incredible strain on people, and so sometimes people find themselves in over their head, over leveraged, financially
Hmm.
stretched. Sometimes it puts incredible strain on marriages because there's tensions about money and tensions about
Hmm.
spending habits or values or goals. And it also puts a tremendous divide in society. And
Huh.
so there's a lot of diversity in Orange County, 34 different cities all kind of mashed up together. Each one's about 100,000. So you got 3.4 million people in the county. But there's a lot of diversity, but a lot of that diversity is in a sense segregated. And so sometimes
Wow.
you have sub pockets of by ethnic groups. Sometimes you have sub pockets by economic,
Yeah.
I don't want to say class, but by economic, state status, and so that creates an opportunity as a church, first of all, to say, hey, what does the radical body of Christ look like? We're supposed to cut across every strata here, and not just the ethnic and cultural ones, but also the economic ones, and how do we do that, and how do we actually practice that? And it's a challenge. I will also say that there are many, many people who have financial resources that are extremely generous and humble,
Yeah.
and they've got a kingdom lens for resources, and that's really great. And then for others, the job is to show them, it's to pull on the thread. Really, my job is sometimes a little bit like the teacher in Ecclesiastes, is to pull on the thread and let the whole sweater unravel, and to
Right.
say, oh, you think that's what it's about? Let's pull on that. Oh, it's nothing, is it? Okay, what about this? You think status, you think that, let's pull on that and chase that, see how far that goes. And to show them that all of those things are good, but when you make them ultimate, they actually become bad. And that's the
Hmm.
weight of that's again another one of the lies of our age, is you take a good thing and you make it an ultimate thing, all of a sudden it becomes a destructive thing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's such a unique as an outsider. Admittedly, from as an outsider, I grew up in the great state of Montana. So Orange County and the great state of Montana, like I it could be different countries easily, but I can see how unique it would be to disciple or to evangelize in a place like Orange County. But I don't think it's hard to imagine where the human need would be. And as you said,
Mhm.
there are still people that are left behind. There are still groups of
Mhm.
people that are on the outside looking in.
Mhm.
And even just to circle back to our conversation about the fruit of hyper individualism or the age of anxiety, like you referenced, I think in some places, in some ways, a place like Orange County is really can be an embodiment of that because of the success is so
Yes.
often built on that kind of individualism.
That's
Well,
right.
well, let
That's
me
right.
let me ask you a question, Glenn. I'll finish our time with this question. This is my favorite question. I ask this every time. I got some terminology. I want to just admit that I'm fully plagiarizing on this terminology, but I had picked up one day a magazine off a newsstand, and it was about Mother Teresa, and I was reading in my quiet time about the ministry of Mother Teresa, and she utilized this language. Utilized the language "carry Christ."
Mhm.
And I thought it was just really beautiful when she was describing her ministry to those living in the slums or the outcasts or the lepers in India, that she would utilize the language "carry."
Mm.
There's something about that imagery that's, for me, I think is precious, especially in a ministry that has, for years, we've put on backpacks and thrown Bibles and gospel booklets and backpacks
Amazing.
and just carried the gospel to remote areas. But a question that I'm asking to every person that I have jump on this podcast is, when I say the word "carry Christ" or that
Mm.
phrase "carry Christ," what do you think? What does that mean to you today,
Mm.
21st century Glenn Packiam?
Mm. Wow. It is a beautiful phrase, isn't it? I think there are two places my mind goes. The first place it goes to is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament of the Ark of the Covenant, David trying to bring it back to Jerusalem as he's become king. And they put it on a cart, because they'd seen the Philistines do it. And then the cow trips, the cart slips, and then Uzzah tries to grab it, and he gets struck down by God.
Wow.
And you think, oh no, God doesn't want us to come close. It's the opposite. God actually wants you to come close from the beginning, not because it's an accident.
Right.
God wants you to come close on purpose. And so David tells the priest, wait a minute, priests were supposed to carry the ark, not put it on a cart. And so the priests then consecrate themselves and start to carry the ark. And so I think about that because I think every Christian in the New Testament is a priest, and every Christian is meant to be a carrier of God's presence. So we're not meant to have carts in our lives. We're not meant to say, well, let the missionary carry Christ, or let the pastor carry Christ, let the church carry Christ, let the summer camp carry Christ to my teenager. No. You're a carrier. You're a carrier of the presence, which means you got to consecrate yourself. You got to, one of our mentors here at Rock Harbor is a professor at Vanguard University. His name's Bill Doctrum, and he says holiness is usefulness. And I really love that idea, because you clean a dish so that you can use the dish. Consecration is so that we can be used by God. And sometimes we're like, we don't want holiness because we don't actually want the responsibility of being carriers of God's presence. Or we want holiness, but we don't want the responsibility that it's for. And it's like, no, wait a minute, holiness and mission go together. We're consecrated.
That's right.
So we can become carriers, and that's for everybody. But because you said Mother Teresa, my mind also went to another place when you said carry Christ, and I thought about what Jesus said, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And so I'm imagining this dear saint carrying little children in her arms, and as she's carrying the children, she's carrying Christ. And so maybe there's an image here of, gosh, where are the ways that if I can serve, if I can lower myself and wash someone's feet today, that actually what I'm doing is not just lifting that person up, I'm lifting up Jesus.
Oh, that was such a beautiful answer. I have the chills right now. I feel like I could just stop and say a prayer, but Glenn, thanks for taking the time to just have a conversation. We definitely went in a different direction than I thought we would today, but your contribution and your perspective, I guess, on the topic of evangelism, I think it's just so valuable, so 21st century relevant to our audience, both in the West and around the world. It's a reaffirmation that we need to consecrate ourselves, to broaden our message, to see the people around us in the way that Christ did, with disruptive hospitality amongst other things, and to not leave people behind. And so I'll carry away from this message so many, probably just invitations, I think, extended by the Lord to my heart to respond to. So I just want to thank you for taking the time and being with us.
Thank you so much, Tanner. I'm so grateful for you, your family, and for the ministry of Every Home for Christ. I'm a big believer in what you're doing.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, Glenn, if somebody was listening into this and they're just excited about what they're hearing from you, and they wanted to learn more or get in connection with the resources that you have, how would they go about doing that?
Probably the easiest way is my website, which is just glennpackiam.com. Glenn has 2 N's in it. Packiam is Pack-I-am.
Nice.
glennpackiam.com would be the easiest. I'm on Instagram at @gpackiam, also on Twitter, a little bit less these days, but at @gpackiam there as well.
Or they can take the journey to go to Rock Harbor, which is in Orange County, California. So people might need a road trip. Just throwing that out there.
Come on over.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you for joining us today on the Redeeming Missions Podcast. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date on all future episodes. Echoing in the prayer of St. Patrick, Christ with us, Christ before us, Christ behind us, Christ in us. Let us carry Christ to our world. Until next time.